Good afternoon. My name is Serene Chua, your host from the Energy Market Authority of Singapore. Thank you for joining us at the first edition of the SIEW Energy Insights webinar series, which brings you the latest in energy discussions in the run-up to the Singapore International Energy Week, or SIEW, in October. SIEW 2020 will feature a hybrid format, which comprises on-site events combined with live streaming for attendees who are unable to join us in person. Today's webinar, Sustainability in Refining and Petrochemicals, is held in partnership with Clarion Events, organizer of SIEW Partner Event, Asian Downstream Summit and Asian Refining Technology Conference. Please also participate in the short poll, which should have popped up at the start of the webinar. I would now like to hand over to Ms. Yulia Dobrolyubova, Partner for Corporate Sustainability and Climate Change in Southeast Asia ERM, for her presentation. Ms. Dobrolyubova, please.
Thank you, Serene, and good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Yulia Dobrolyubova. I'm partner at ERM, a global provider of sustainability services. And I lead climate change and sustainability work of ERM in Southeast Asia, the region that has been my home for the last 10 years. Among today's presentation will be about key transition risks and opportunities that companies in the petrochemicals and refining sector are facing already today, and that are linked to the whole transformation of the global energy market. And most importantly, what companies can do to address those risks. Let's go to the next slide. And to the next slide, please. So to set the stage, I must say that climate change is real. And unfortunately, real are economic losses from already observed climate impacts. So if you take a look at the pictures on the left, for instance, the one above, that was taken in my home country, Russia, in its Arctic part. And you can see what could mean if climate impacts are not taken into account during that project design stage. So that happened already to the pipeline in the Arctic because of the increased thawing of permafrost. What could be more relevant for Southeast Asia and for petrochemical and refining companies here in this region is increased severity and frequency of climate-related natural hazards, such as storms, wind speed, for example, or increased hurricanes. And unfortunately, all of that has already impact on the company's infrastructure, assets, and even people who work there. And according to scientists, even if the global community would be able to limit the temperature rise within 1.52 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, some of those climate-related hazards would still be observed and could create risks for the company. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, climate-related physical risks is just part of the bigger picture. There is also a big set of so-called transition risks linked to the transformation of the global economy towards low-carbon pathway. And those risks can range from increased investors' pressure, consumers' pressure, demanding for low-carbon products, to regulatory requirements, for instance, new carbon pricing policies. But this all can also create disruption on the market. New technologies appear that especially impact companies whose traditional business models depend on fossil fuels, in particular petrochemicals and refining companies. However, the slow carbon economy transition can also present opportunities for the sector. For example, forward-thinking companies already start redesigning their business strategies, trying to seize the opportunity from this low carbon transition, diversifying their assets, their investments, and also looking into new innovative technologies, for instance, such as storage solutions, biofuels, or even innovative ones like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Let's move to the next slide. On the next slide, you will see an illustration of carbon policy risks for the companies, particularly those dependent on fossil fuels. So a growing number of jurisdictions, cities, companies around the world are introducing price on carbon, meaning that every ton of CO2 or other greenhouse gas emitted into the air would have a price. In Southeast Asia, for example, Singapore already has a carbon tax in place. And other countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, or Thailand are seriously considering introducing similar policies with a tax or cap on emission and emission trading scheme. Indonesia will probably be the next one with a voluntary phase of the emission trading scheme that would cover power and manufacturing companies. The next slide, please. So understanding those challenges, a growing number of companies in the oil and gas, in downstream sectors, and other sectors, of course, are already taking actions to address transition risks. And here you can see an example from Total, for example, that took a zero carbon commitment following BP and Shell earlier. And as you can see, already more than 900 companies have committed themselves to setting science-based targets in line with the global climate change Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. It would be interesting to take a look at what drives companies in the oil and gas and downstream sectors in taking ambitious climate actions. Next slide. And here are the results of the recent survey that IREM conducted together with Yale University. And as you can see on the right, the blue bar, it shows that the main driver mentioned by executives and senior managers of oil and gas and downstream companies globally is the investors' pressure. And this is also pretty much driven by the new framework set by the Task Force for Climate-Related Risk Disclosure, TCFD. And what we also have noticed that forward-thinking companies do not just disclose their climate-related risks. They also use that as means and as an opportunity to look deeper into overall business strategy and incorporate risk mitigation measures into their future plans. And I must say here that it's not just investors' pressure, it's also consumers' pressure and new regulations and overall thinking about the immediate growth of the company that drive them to take climate actions. Next slide. Another question that we asked executives in the sector is what they think as the most effective driver in furthering their low carbon agenda. And as you can see here, one of those that they think would be most effective is the change balance in their assets, as well as finding good leadership within the company, whether at CEO level or within the executive team. Next, please. Now probably will be the most important part of my presentation on basically what companies can do to address climate risks. Next slide. Here is an overview of 4 key action areas for companies willing to take ambitious climate targets. The first and foremost will be the red circle. Of course, it will be looking into your own emissions and understand what could be an opportunity to reduce them. And this can be done through absolutely different means and measures from, for example, changing fuels or energy sources that you use to more low carbon ones. This could be implementation of more energy efficient technologies or new technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, operational improvements, leading also to more efficient use of energy, broad awareness campaigns and trainings for the staff, making sure that they follow the climate action plan, and also, of course, internal policies around climate that could be internal carbon pricing, different taxes, or even zero waste policy, for example. Then 2 circles below, sorry, can we move back? Thank you. Then 2 circles below actually show another area of opportunity for companies, especially those who do not see enough opportunity yet within their boundaries at the corporate level, facility level, how to reduce emissions. And this is so-called offsetting or insetting, basically buying carbon emission reduction certificates from projects elsewhere. The difference between offsetting and insetting is that offsetting can be done from project anywhere in the world as long as this project is certified under one of the carbon standards. Whereas insetting is when you support projects along your supply chain. And I think for petrochemical and refining sectors, that could be an interesting opportunity to invest, for example, in bioproducts and biofuels, to source them sustainably and at the same time reducing your carbon emissions. The last but not the least is the upper blue circle, where the company can also help others to reduce their emissions, for instance, through consumer awareness programs or investing into technologies that can be used wider than the economy. Finally, on that slide, the central circle is the new trend that we have witnessed in the oil and gas sector. And perhaps some of the companies present today at the webinar have also looked into that. That so-called carbon or climate funds that the company can establish at the corporate level, helping to support activities around all those 4 focus areas. Now let's move on, please. So this is an example of Shell, what the company is doing already to reach their zero carbon targets. And as you can see here, the range of measures would be exactly from what the company can do in-house, like operational efficiency, shifting to cleaner fuels and energy sources, to investment into offsetting and setting projects around afforestation and agriculture. Next slide, please. And here we outlined for you an example of a climate leadership journey that a company can follow, starting from basic things like assessing your greenhouse gas emissions and also looking at what peers are doing, to, of course, assessment of climate risks, both physical and transition, up to strategy design, identifying what options are available in-house and in terms of offsetting, and also, of course, disclosure and overall governance structures. But just one thing to mention here is that this is just an example, and each company can define itself which components of the climate journey could be more important for them at this particular moment. Next slide, please. This would be an example of a very good tool. It's called Marginal Abatement Curve Tool, or MAC. So it helps companies to identify the most cost-efficient options to reduce their emissions. Basically, expressed in US dollars or whatever currency per ton of CO2 reduced or avoided. And this is a marker for a real refinery project in Southeast Asia, where I was working with. And as you can see, all measures that are above the zero line, in this case, carbon capture, utilization, and storage options, would be yet not economically attractive. But as soon as you introduce internal carbon price, which would be a blue dotted line, some of them could become financially more feasible. So this tool can really help you understand what options are available already or could be potentially economically attractive for you if the carbon price is there. Next slide. And I think that's going to be the last one from my side. Just key observations on behalf of ERM, what leaders in the downstream sectors are already doing to become climate leaders. So first of all, is become friends with your investors and get real and transparent with them in terms of climate risks. Secondly, companies already need to understand that profound changes are needed in line with the overall economic transition to low carbon pathway. This is unavoidable and needs to happen. And the sooner companies start integrating climate risk into your decision making, the better. Third one, obviously, you would need to equip your managers and executives who would potentially lead this change. And don't forget about the younger generation of your staff. We also call them Greta Thunberg generation. They're so keen to make a change in the world and can potentially help in your overall climate agenda. Fourth point is carbon data. As we say, you cannot improve something that you don't understand how it works. So getting basics right is also important. So GHG inventory and data management processes at the company level. And finally, the last point is also to understand that carbon pricing is unavoidable. And more companies and countries are introducing these policies. And the sooner you start integrating this into your business operations, the better. And finally, I wish all of you to harness those new opportunities and find your leadership in really become at the forefront of this climate action in Southeast Asia. Thank you. And for more details, you can then contact me or my colleague Deepak, and you can also find in the report that we have produced together with the university, which is available on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dobrolyubova. A gentle reminder that our poll will be closing soon. I would now like to invite Mr. Thye, Manager, Group Technical Solutions, Project Delivery and Technology, PETRONAS, for his presentation. Mr. Mok, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mok from PETRONAS. I think Yulia has given us some perspective in relation to strategic. So I will be more touching on the technology side. So my presentation will talking about flattening the climate change curve and how the oil and gas industry can adapt to sustainability mode. Next slide, please. Before we start, I would like to set certain context correctly. First of all, that we need to realize and understand that the way we consume hydrocarbon resources is unsustainable. As indicated in the left side of the slide, the fossil fuel that we are consuming will end up in CO2 accumulations in the environment, which will cause environmental impact. If we look at the right side of the consumptions model, this is a sustainable model where the CO2 actually being released by the way that we consume the hydrocarbon resources will be absorbed or will be assimilated back via the process of photosynthesis from the plant to generate back the resources, the carbon resources. Here we talk about biomass resources. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this slide basically try to link the three different concepts, which is sustainable, renewable, and bio-based, which is somehow different, but somehow can be used interchangeably and interrelated. So for sustainable, let's understand it as there is no carbon accumulation, or we say that the carbon loop is closed. For renewable, we usually refer to infinite resources, mainly to say that, for instance, like fossil fuel is a finite resources, mainly if you have an oil field, so the resources will be depleted after certain years of extractions. But if we talk about infinite resources, be it like soybean oil cultivate plantation or palm plantations or other plantations, we can assume that this is infinite resources because the replanting actually will ensure the renewable supply of the raw material, or be it the foodstuff, the hydrocarbon. Bio-based basically touch on the concept of new carbon. Let's go to the next slide to understand it better for bio-based. Okay, in accordance to ASTM, the bio-based is basically referring to new or recent organic carbon as compared to old organic carbons. To make the understanding simple, a living tree is 100% bio-based because it's keep on exchanging carbon with the environment. Whereas a tree, after decompose for many, many years that turn into coal, is 0% bio-based because it stopped exchanging the carbon content with the environment. Next slide. Okay, this is the most important point that I would like to talk about. That what can we do to basically fight climate change? I would like to quote this analogy to the way, to the current scenario that we are familiar with, which is how we are fighting or how we are containing the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we are doing, that we keep on saying that we are flattening the curve. So in the case of COVID-19, we are not actually eliminating or killing the virus, but what we are doing is mitigating the spread of the virus. It's the same in climate change. What we are doing, that we are not saving the earth or we're not reverting it to the original form, but what we are doing is that we are buying time for us to have for technologies and scientists to have a longer period of times to adapt and to introduce the new technology to save the situations. So let's look at the curve right now. So on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, definitely is actually referring to time frame. Whereas from the y-axis, that we can actually put in various aspects, for instance, like climate change, temperature rise, sea level rise, or oceans acidification. So the environment that's suitable for human being, there is an envelope that, for instance, like currently scientists usually cap it as 2 degrees C temperature rise or 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise. I think measured back to baseline on 1960 or 1980. So what we are doing now is that we are not basically trying to resolve the issue, but we are trying to contain the temperature rise on the acceptable limit that we can still live in this environment or ecosystem. So on the right side, you can see that I put in 3 clusters of different technology that currently actually being adopted. So the first cluster on top of it, basically referring to what currently we are doing, or what I would like to term it that what commercially is available, or what we are doing. For instance, like implementation of biofuel, biodiesel, bioethanol, and the usage of bio-based chemical, which means that we produce the chemical from bioresources. Then the second will be the renewable electricity. I mean, currently we can see a lot of investment in terms of solar and wind electricity. And then the third one is on plastic, bioplastics such as PLA, polylactic acid, or PHA, as well as the effort for plastic recycling. The second cluster I put it in is that the technology is somewhat matured, but with certain hurdle or certain resistance that we need to overcome. For instance, such as hydrogen initiative, such as battery technology, which means that we are actually trying to improve the battery technology. I mean, or maybe introducing new technology for battery storage or energy storage, such as a redox battery. This is a couple with renewable energy, because in renewable energy, we have the peak production period. So we need to store the energy to cater for the low production period. Algae cultivation, we will touch later. The last cluster, I just try to put in something which I call some breakthrough technology, but it's still at the very initial stage of the research. For instance, like CO2 and H2S reforming, that we know that this is a 2 major culprit from refining. And there are people actually investigating how to reform it into syngas and elemental sulfur. The next 2 things is basically that we are trying to invent in technology that how can we actually emulate plant actually to do the CO2 fixations. Let's move to next slide. Next. This is basically how bioplastic will help eliminate the CO2 accumulation. And we can see that it's actually derived from bio-based material, and then the CO2 actually released based on the degradation of bioplastic will be absorbed back to the plant, and then this is closing the loop. The major issue of bioplastic is same with biofuel is that we don't have enough crops or biomaterial to support all the plastic consumption required by human beings. So we can see that bioplastic initiatives need to be coupled with plastic recycling. For instance, like current technology trend for plastic recycling is that conversion of plastic via the process of pyrolysis to pyroil, and then we can basically crack the pyroil into ethylene and then make that into plastic. Let's move to next slide. Okay, as discussed earlier, I will talk a little bit about algae cultivation. As we know, that algae cultivation has been there, I think, more than 20 years. However, with limited commercial success. The reason actually being that it is energy intensive to do the cultivation and extraction processes. But however, I am a strong believer or supporter for algae. The reasons being that for a given piece of land, the biomass generations or algae oil generations is highest compared to the current commercial crop that we are having, for instance, like palm oil, soybean oil, and corn oil. If we take the notes that land is a finite resources, the land available for human habitation, the land available for agriculture will be limited. And having in mind that human population is keep on increasing, there will be a tipping point that we will have the issue of land to support us in terms of habitation, in terms of industry, in terms of commercial, and in terms of agricultural. That is the time where we need to rely on algae. Algae basically solve 2 issues here. Firstly, it will basically resolve certain issue of land issue. And then secondly, it actually producing food and fuel. On top of that, it's being actually doing the carbon fixations. So for me, this algae oil is actually something that is actually worth looking at, even though with a lot of failed commercial venture. For example, that we understand that a lot of oil major actually is still actively involved or actively invest in the research of algae oil. For instance, ExxonMobil is actually investing $600 million based on public domain information to develop a 10-year program to make algae work. So let's move to the next slide. This is the last slide that I'm having. Basically, this is some integrations model that how we can make use of current infrastructure and incorporate in sustainability technology. For instance, we talk about wind and solar as renewable energy. So in order to solve the peak productions issue, we can basically producing a green hydrogen, for instance, like based on electrolysis, and then the hydrogen can be spiked into the natural gas grid, and it can be used as a natural gas. And then during off-peak production period, we can make full use of the gas turbine plant to generate back electricity and put back into the grid. So this system actually is currently being studied, I think, by various jurisdictions, for instance, like Australia and Singapore. I believe Singapore government also study in these regions, this aspect of technology. The next aspect about this technology is that we can do CO2 fixations through a process called methanation. Methanation is a very well-established process. I mean, in petrochemical plant, for instance, like in ammonia plant, before going to the ammonia converter, all the CO and CO2 actually being converted to. So what we can do here, that we can, all the CO2 actually being captured, we combine to green hydrogen and produce methane and then inject back into the natural gas grid on the current infrastructure that we are having. So the list is not exclusive. I just give certain example that we can trigger and put everybody, I mean, all the industry leaders that attend this webinar, we have certain idea or concepts that how to drive sustainability initiative or initiative in our respective organizations. That's all from me today. Thank you for your attention. I'll pass back to the organizer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mok. May I also welcome back Ms. Dobrolyubova for the Q&A session. I will now hand over to our moderator, Mr. Tim Rockell, Chairman for the Energy and Utility Business Committee at the British Chamber of Commerce in Singapore.
Thank you very much, Serene, and thank you to you and your EMA colleagues for putting on this SIEW Energy Insights webinar. We're going to have the panel discussion now, and we did start a little bit late, so we will go on for a little bit longer as well for those of you who are asking questions. I'll come to your polling questions in just a minute, but first of all, I wanted to bring back Yulia. So Yulia, it'd be nice if you could actually summarize, you spoke about some of the drivers and some of the mitigators, but could you talk briefly about what are some of the wider risks for ASEAN, so in our South Asia region, if we don't move into a sustainable world? So I'd be interested to get your views straight away, please.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. I hope you hear me better now.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So as I mentioned in my presentation, there are two types of risks, or if you want, drivers around climate change, and for ASEAN in particular. The first set of risks would be around physical climate impacts. So all kind of increased natural hazards that they may impact infrastructure, facilities, and even people working for companies. And on the other hand, there are low carbon economy transition risks that companies also need to adapt as soon as possible. And I would say, particularly for Southeast Asia, that could be very important because our region still depends pretty much on fossil fuels like coal, oil. So yeah, that's something that our companies and countries in general would need to address, and the sooner the better.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well to all of the audience. We do have a very regional and indeed international audience here, really much reflecting that it is the Singapore International Energy Week. I can see some questions coming in, but I'd like to get to the polling questions straight away. If we could put up the first polling question, please, and that was, where should energy companies focus their emissions reductions over the next 5 years? And thank you for everybody who voted. We can see there the numbers who voted as well as the percentage, and very healthy numbers. So almost, a third of people voting there is talking about that energy companies should decarbonize their own operations with renewable energy in both the upstream and the downstream. And coming in second there was promoting energy efficient technologies in transport and waste reduction. So I think that's we see good support for the others as well. Now I want to move and bring you in as well, Thye, into this question. The theme for this year's SIEW is creating our own low carbon energy future together. And that's 7 words, and I know that the organisers of the SIEW picked these words very carefully, and every word means something, and everybody could pick something out of those words. But perhaps in the context of question 1, in terms of where people should focus in decarbonising their operations, what does the SIEW theme mean to you? Creating our low-carbon energy future together. Mr. Mock.
Thank you, Tim. I think the theme is very the theme for this SIEW is very correct. That basically currently the COVID-19 actually provide us a golden opportunity to actually rebaseline and then rethinking of how that we are going to move forward, especially when the government in all over the world is trying to jumpstart the economy with some quantitative easing financial measure. So I believe that the investments or the fresh fund or capital should basically focus on technology or projects that basically more focus on sustainability or sustainable technology, for instance, like renewable electricity, for instance, like the hydrogen initiative being taken by various jurisdictions, Singapore, Australia, and UK. So I believe this is a good opportunity for us to sit down and think and then re-strategize and moving forward. And basically, I think that the oil and gas industry is having the pool of resources, the talents, as well as the capital is actually in a good positions to direct the way that we consume hydrocarbon resources into a more sustainable manner. Okay, back to you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Yulia, I'm sure you'll be attending the SIEW. Kind of, what's your reflection on the theme? And I'll just repeat it for everybody: creating our low-carbon energy future together.
Perfect. I would also add to that circular economy future. And in my personal understanding, downstream sectors like refining and petrochemicals actually in the center of the circular economy concept, because they're so much aligned with the energy production, but at the same time, they're much closer to industries that consume their products and eventually end users. So that would be really interesting to see how the circular economy thinking can be integrated into low carbon transition and overall development of the sector.
Thank you very much, Yulia. So that's 2 perspectives there, and I thank everyone once again for their 2 presentations, bringing things together. And we'll get to some of the topics that were discussed. If I could pull up polling question number 2, and that's currently who is taking the lead. And if I just scroll down to that there, hopefully everybody can see it. So the question was, who is currently taking the lead in driving action for climate change mitigation? And coming out there very strong, 37% is government, but also I think a joint second, we're looking at society and general public and industry. So actually quite a low one for investors. And I think, you know, that's interesting because Yulia, I think on your chart, you had a 90% significance for investors, if I recall that slide correctly. Can I bring you back, Yulia, and just comment on what you see as the results from that poll and whether that surprises you or not?
I guess it would depend pretty much on in which region you ask the companies about that. In certain regions, obviously governments would be the main driver. In others, like in the US, for example, companies do not wait for the government to introduce policies and measures. They actually lead this change. And I would say the reason why investment pressure was 90% in ERAM's and Yale's university research is that most of the respondees would come from Europe and the US, where markets really drive the change. Here in Southeast Asia, indeed, governments play a very important role. And answering your question, Tim, also, I think governmental pressure would remain probably one of the key drivers going forward.
Yeah, maybe just follow up on that, Yulia, that, you know, the IEA in their recent report said that for 2020, we could expect a 20% reduction in energy investment during 2020. That's a significant fall. What do you think is going to be the impact of that fall in investment on sustainability? Even though the forecasts say that investments could decrease, it shouldn't really stop the sector from the transformation, because anyways, economy is shifting already, and that's not a shift of like 1 or 2 years. That's a
complete transformation that will happen anyways. And the sooner companies prepare for that, the better. And in terms of funding, I mean, luckily there are a lot of various sources of finance for low carbon actions by the companies, and not necessarily from investment side, but those could be governmental incentives or some incentives by the international development organizations that companies could look into.
Mm. And Thye, we are seeing, emergence of modern, larger, integrated refinery petrochemical complexes in the region. Perhaps you could just tell us briefly, you gave us a very good presentation, but what does good look like in the configuration of a modern, sustainable, integrated refinery and petrochemical complex?
Thank you, Tim. First of all, I think we noticed that there's in order to drive efficiency, the modern petrochemical complex is growing in size because this will improve the efficiency and definitely will reduce the carbon footprint. So, however, if we talk about the future of the integrated complex, personally, I actually feel that the future refinery should take into considerations of adopting or getting in the renewable feedstock. For instance, the future of the refinery should be able to take in hydrocarbon or fossil fuel on top of renewable resources such as vegetable oil that actually can be co-processed together to produce the fuel as well as petrochemicals. In addition, I would like to quote example because I think in my presentation, I touched a little bit on bioplastic. Currently, bioplastic, which is PLA, polylactic acid, is produced from sugar. Actually, intensive research done by the major manufacturer of PLA, bioplastic in the world, that basically they actually using the strains of microbes that can produce lactic acid from methane, the methane gas. So with this, we can actually have an integrated petrochemical complex that producing PLA bioplastic that can actually work on both feedstock, which is sugar as well as methane. So this is how I believe that the future of mega or the future of the refinery and petrochemical complex should take into considerations. And I would like to add on top of that what happens to the smaller scale of the refinery that is currently in operation or the older refinery. I would like to give some perspective at what happened in Europe and US. There are certain oil majors that converting their smaller refinery, which is not so efficient or which is not able to process difficult crude or sour crude, to producing purely vegetable oil to get the hydroprocessed diesel or as well as hydroprocessed jet. So this worked well for the renewable diesel because the capacity is smaller and as well it's actually integrate. I mean, if you look at the whole spectrum, it's actually integrate between the renewable resources, which is vegetable oil, used oil, sludge oil, waste oil, compared to complement to the existing portfolio of making use of fossil fuel. That's all from me. I hope I give some perspective to the audience. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Thye. And I think, we will kind of stick with you, actually. There's a question here from Paul Booley, who talks about agreeing with your concept of flattening the curve and maybe introducing, blue hydrogen coupled with carbon capture and storage. Now, I know you want to talk about introduction of other areas as well. You mentioned biofuels and particularly algae. Would you like to talk about that? And perhaps if you could also, in your answer, just give a steer as to whether we're seeing dynamics in the industry in Southeast Asia. We do have new plants coming up, of course, in Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, Indonesia, and we're seeing older plants being shut down in places like, Japan, smaller plants in Philippines, Australia even, and of course, Europe. So there are different market dynamics here. So perhaps you can answer Paul's question. Peter Godfrey made the point here about what can the downstream do in this region. But talking about these market dynamics, how are new technologies like hydrogen, like algae, like biofuels, carbon capture and storage? I mean, it's a big question, but kind of where is the focus? Where is the priority from your standpoint?
Okay. If I read the questions correctly, I think the focus is on this region. I take it as Southeast Asia.
Correct.
If we look at the adoptions or the embarks or the adoption of sustainable technology, definitely various economies will have a various degree of progress. If you look at Europe, which is far more advanced, they already have the Renewable Energy Directive 2, which has set a very ambitious target to achieve in 2050. But let's look back at Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is basically I would call it a developing regions, I mean, with all those developing economy. And Southeast Asia is also a very well-versed or very diverse in biomass diversity or biodiversity, because we have the tropical rainforest and subtropical rainforest. So what I would like to, my personal opinion is that the oil and gas player in this region should seriously look into sustainable initiative by looking into what is available in this region. Like for instance, in Indonesia and in Malaysia, or in Thailand and Philippines. Take example for Thailand. Thailand is the second largest exporter of sugar in the world behind Brazil. So we can see that there is a big investment in polylactic acid, which is the bioplastic from Total Corbion from Europe. They are setting up their manufacturing facility in Thailand and making it their main manufacturing hub to produce bioplastic to support the whole world. So for instance, like in Malaysia and Indonesia, I mean, we have palm oil cultivations, and in Philippines, we have coconut oil cultivations. So the industry, I mean, for instance, the oil and gas industry should start looking into exploring how to make use of these rich biomass resources available in this region and incorporate into our sustainable development game plan. To me, I view this is very important because the oil and gas player today should basically looking at the business beyond long-term horizon, for instance, like 30 years or 40 years, rather than just stick to the conventional investment onto the petrochemical complex. That's all from me, Tim.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'd like to bring Yulia back in here, particularly on the topic of biofuels. So we know that biofuels, you know, they are contentious, and we know between Malaysia and EU, there is some debate going on right now. But are biofuels the answer, Yulia?
Well, that's a good question, Tim, and it pretty much depends on like the way those biofuels are produced in a sustainable manner or not. I would say it could be a temporary solution in terms of mitigating GHG emissions. If you especially like use it partially with other more traditional fossil fuels. And especially in this region, I would say the potential is quite high, because normally we talk about feedstock risk. And here, Southeast Asia is quite known for being an agricultural center, and there are a lot of agricultural regions that could be used potentially to produce the feedstock. And the good thing that doing so, it's possible also to address some social issues, like, for example, creating additional impacts for farmers, or even avoid some air pollution. Like in Thailand, for example, it's connected also to burning, uncontrolled burning of agricultural residues, instead of them being actually used in the economy.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that. I think that's good. And we got some questions coming in on different types of technology, and perhaps we can talk to them as well. But I think, Mr. Mok, you wanted to elaborate on the algae, and you gave a good summary of that. But how fast is that technology going to come on, and what difference is it going to make when it does come on stream?
To talk about algae, as I mentioned in my presentations, algae has been people has been investing in algae for the past, I think, more than 20 years, I believe. But however, we can see that a lot of failure, a lot of unsuccessful venture in algae. So however, the reasons being that if we look at strictly looking into carbon footprint, I think even until today, the algae is actually producing a negative carbon footprint, which means it's not actually reducing the carbon footprint, because the processes, the energy actually required to cultivate and to extract the oil is actually a lot. That explains why algae oil is far more expensive than the rest of the crops oil, such as palm oil, such as soybean oil. But I look at algae differently, because I look at it on the strategic point of view, because algae is very efficient in terms of land usage. And I always believe that land is a finite resources. With the increase in human populations, there's one day that we were actually running out of land for our habitation, for our industrial activity, and for our agricultural activity. That will be the point, or that will be the day when algae is very important, because algae will solve two issues. Firstly, it will solve the fuel issue, or it will produce some algae oil. And then secondly, it will solve the food issue, because algae is actually a good source of food. That's why we can see this is a very good strategic investment. And we can see that a lot of reputable oil majors, for instance, like I mentioned ExxonMobil, and even I understand that Eni actually invested quite heavily in algae. So we can see that the area of research currently is basically to increase the yield or to make the process more efficient. There's 2 points that we need to look at. Firstly, is we look at the algae itself, one algae cell. So we have to increase the oil content from the algae. And then secondly will be the density of the culture, which means that for a given volume, in terms of the reactor or the pond, it should actually produce more algae. So I think it's not good to elaborate in this area on the biotechnology because it takes a lot of time. But what I'm trying to say is that for algae to be able to make it commercially viable, firstly, the production process has to make efficient so that it actually uses less energy. We can do this 2 ways. One is improve the extraction process, and then second, actually increase the yield, which is a lot of research actually currently being done. Second tipping point will be by natural happening, because the land cost will keep on increasing because land is a finite resource. So there will be up to a point where the land cost will be too expensive. That will make the conventional crop, be it like corn, soya beans, sugarcane, palm oil, more expensive to be able to maintain because of the land cost is higher. That is the point in time where algae will be relevant. That's why I believe that is why people still invest in the research of algae. Pass back to you, Tim.
Yeah, and I'm going to pass it straight back to you because we do have a question here on carbon capture and storage. And just wanted to ask you, this is a question from Abiruchi from Kuwait at Nanyang Technological University. And he's asking, is the industry hesitant to adopt CCS currently? And what's happening in terms of R&D and how fast can CCS technology be retrofitted? Are you seeing, just briefly, any examples of carbon capture and storage in this region?
Okay, CCS, carbon capture and storage or sequestration. Yeah. From the technology standpoint, if you ask me, I think it is matured. But the problem is, okay, what CCS is doing is that all the carbon actually from the various resources, be it upstream productions, from refinery or petrochemical, actually is being captured by the acid gas removal system, and then actually is being compressed back into the reservoir. It's just like how the reservoir actually store the natural gas, store the petroleum. We just find a suitable reservoir and then we just compress it in. To be frank, I'm not a believer of CCS technology because it's something like when my wife asked me to clean the house, and actually I just sweep everything under the carpet and I have a very expensive carpet because the cost of compression is very high. But if you ask me about the relevancy of this technology, yes, it is relevant. It's important to flatten the curve because what it does is that it captures the carbon and then it stores it in the reservoir to prevent it to go into the atmosphere and causing the harm. The industry basically is ready. The technology is there, but of course it's coming with a cost. So that actually will depend on how the industry interact with the regulator. So if there is carbon tax imposed, then there is no choice for the industry to implement or to adopt CCS technology. But however, we have to bear in mind that the cost of the compressions will be passed through to the consumer because we have to pay a higher price for the petrochemical or for the energy cost. So these are, from technology standpoint, it is matured. CCS technology is there. Regulations, I believe certain jurisdictions have a strict implementation of CCS technology. But we need to strike a balance, between the energy price, the petrochemical price, as well as how we are going to manage the amount of CO2 that we release to the atmosphere. This is my viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think going back to the SIEW theme, one of the most important words that's emerging from this conversation is the word together. And whether it's regulators, whether it's industry, whether it's consumer, whether it's nations working together, that really seems to be an important theme that's going to come out if we're going to achieve this decarbonised world. I'd like to move now to polling question number 3, and then I'll bring back in Yulia and ask a question that's been posed by Melissa Lowe. And Melissa has asked a question around the impact of carbon pricing. And the question that we asked all of you and the audience here was, what should be done with the proceeds or collections from government-introduced carbon tax policies? And 50% of you here said should be used to promote emissions and waste reduction technologies. Another 43% said directed towards broader climate change mitigation, e.g. mitigation against rising sea levels. And then only 7% of you said that it should be treated as contributions to the total tax pool. So I think that's very interesting, Yulia, and I want to bring you in here. And, Melissa's question was, to what extent does a carbon price play a part in innovation in refining and petrochemical sector? And are there any countries in Southeast Asia looking to implement a carbon price in the next few years to drive innovation? So what have you seen from your survey, Yulia, in terms of how investments, how direction by government, how revenues raised from carbon taxes can be focused back onto the industry?
All right. Well, first of all, the main idea of carbon price is actually to make low carbon technologies more economically attractive. So what has been mentioned already by my colleague is that with introducing of carbon price policy, for example, such technologies as CCS could become more attractive, for example, and would make economic sense. In terms of the petrochemicals and refining industry, of course, carbon pricing policies would be particularly motivating in thinking on what could be done to diversify their portfolios and change their common business models to integrate more renewables, for example, or even think about new product lines. And maybe just getting back to the question about proceeds from the tax. Actually, most countries use those for mitigation, but also climate adaptation measures indeed, because those is very difficult to find funding from the commercial perspective. Many of them, unfortunately, do not make economic sense, and that's where proceeds from the taxes often land in the end.
Thanks. Yeah, very good. And Thye, we're talking about taxes and directing them back into the industry. And when we talk about carbon, governments have set targets in the future. The UK government, which is hosting, of course, COP26, which is a victim of COVID. It's been postponed by a year. But, we're really, the debate has moved on now to talking about net zero emissions. And for me, I think, one of the most important words there is net. It's not zero emissions, it's net zero emissions. So how fast can technology make a difference in trying to get to this pathway to net zero? And, let's just talk about, where the investment will come from a bit later on. But how fast can this new technology that we've been talking about be introduced to get to this net position?
Yeah, I think, Tim, you bring a very good perspective. It's not zero emission, but it's net zero. So which means that there is certain way like offsettings or carbon accounting that can be implemented to achieve the state of net zero. So as I mentioned just now, various jurisdictions in around the world is at various level of economic development. So that actually will reflect on the various degree to adoptions or to switchings to sustainable technology. So Europe is always in the forefront. I mean, that's why they are actually launching the Renewable Energy Directive 2 to support, I think their target is 2050 to achieve certain net zero percentage. Let me quickly switch back to about algae oil. I mean, for instance, like in RED2, algae oil is classified as certain advanced technology. So even though today it is not really carbon positive, I mean, carbon, the life cycle carbon is not really favorable. However, I think the jurisdiction in EU, European Union, they understands the need to to promote algae technology. That's why they give certain advantage in terms of the regulations, so that to promote investment in the algae cultivation and algae processes, and to make the business invest in that. So back to the question of technology, I mean, we can see certain lists that in my presentation, certain technology actually having in a certain degree of readiness, and there's certain technological hurdle that we need to overcome in order to make it more commercially available. So it's a very broad question. So I would like to explain in a broader manner. So for instance, like if you ask me whether the technology is ready for 2050, it's not really ready, but however, that should not be the excuse that we are stopped doing it. So we should actually investing or involved in those technology that is currently readily available and having certain degree of commercial success. For instance, like biofuel and bioplastic and plastic recycling. Then there must be certain investment, I mean, to look into those technology that really can make the change. For instance, like photocatalytic conversions or the artificial photosynthesis that basically will convert, I mean, will try to create artificial plant that will do the photosynthesis. But if we look at the technology readiness, I still think that we have a gap in various technology that we are having here. That's why the concept of flattening the curve is important, because we are not solving the problem. We are just trying to get more time for the scientists, for the engineers, for the technologists to invest or to come up with technology that really can actually bring a better benefit or better impact. That's all from me, Thye. Thank you.
Thank you once again. I'm going to bring back Yulia here as we look at the last polling question, and that would be what would be the source of innovation in building a sustainable refining and petrochemical sector? And racing in the lead is cross-sector industry collaboration. It's interesting to see that one has really leapt out, and quite a big focus as well. Well, not a big focus, but second, of course, is in-house R&D. So I think, the industry is really talking about solving this by itself. But perhaps, Yulia, I could bring you in here. Are we talking about energy efficiency? Are we talking about resource efficiency? So perhaps, you could talk about what are some of the key initiatives that we're seeing, whether it's economic or technological, or what's happening around feedstock, or what companies are doing from end use. What are we seeing, in terms of bringing more resource efficiency into the sector?
I think it's a combination of things, actually. And the respondent's absolutely right that it has to be collaboration. And as mentioned before, downstream industries are really in the middle of the whole supply chain. So it really cannot be solved by petrochemicals and refining sectors just by their own. It's impossible. So first of all, of course, you can look into your own emissions, and you should. But then there is a lot of work around supply chain, for example, in relation to bioproducts and feedstock from renewable sources, right? A lot of work needs to be done also downstream in relation to use of plastics, for example, right? Or other end products that petrochemicals and refining companies are producing. So I would say it should be really a great collaborative effort, perhaps also with close collaboration with the government, because it's just of its cross-sectoral nature. Also, I'm pretty sure that other organizations, like development organizations, can help in that. And they're looking a lot into making the circular economy a key thing going forward. And I think innovation, of course, looking into innovative technologies, not just in terms of energy efficiency and resource efficiency, but also like new type of products would be especially interesting for those sectors. And
Good.
Whoever seizes this opportunity could become a new leader.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, Thye, and ideally in less than a minute, this answer to polling question number 4, does it surprise you? And could you also supplement your answer? What good examples are you seeing of cross-sector industry collaboration? Is it really happening?
Okay, I still go back to technology. I think it's happening, the cross-sector collaborations. I mean, I quote the example of bioplastic. The two largest polylactic acid is basically a good example of cross-sector. Let's quote, for example, the largest bioplastic or PLA producer in the world. This basically is a collaboration between Cargill and Dow previously, and then currently actually the partner actually turned to PTT, which is the Thai national oil company. Cargill has been producing lactic acid for use in pharmaceutical and food. And they try to actually create an industry, bioplastic industry, make use of their feedstock. And they collaborate with Dow, which is a petrochemical player, and producing the bioplastic, which is PLA. And currently, they are the largest producer of bioplastic. The same happened to the second largest bioplastic producer, which is basically the collaboration between Total and Corbion. I mean, Total is one of the largest integrated oil and gas player. Corbion is another big biotechnology company. So they collaborate, and then they actually go into the business of bioplastics. So this is basically, for me, the trends that we should actually move forward, that the collaboration is between the conventional oil and gas player with the biotechnology as well as the agricultural player to create a new niche of the industry in a more sustainable manner. Yeah, back to you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we're getting to the end of the session here, and you know, we could probably talk for another hour, and certainly there'll be a chance for more conversation at the Singapore International Energy Week itself. I mean, I'm going to ask you for your final thoughts, but just to kind of reflect, you know, refining is clearly a cyclical business, and there's a whole bunch of dynamics going on right now in the petrochemical industry. And of course, this overarching driver of climate change and how that's been impacted by COVID. There was a question that came up there about the impacts of COVID, and I don't know if you want to draw upon that in your final remarks. We certainly had a session which people can look at, organised by the British Chamber of Commerce, where we brought financiers together to ask the question of what would be the impact of energy transition from COVID in terms of their investments. And we mentioned those investments that are falling away as well. In terms of summing up, you know, we have mentioned new technologies. We mentioned biofuels, we mentioned hydrogen, we mentioned algae, we mentioned the carbon capture and storage. But what this really emphasizes me is two things. One is that we're in this together, and I think that's a very important word from the SIEW theme this year. But also, this is going to take decades to happen. And so if we're going to get to targets which are being set for 2030, we need to start now. Even for 2050, when you look at industries that are out there, such as shipping and aviation, we're really going to have to start now. So perhaps I could just ask each of the panelists in kind of 30 seconds or less, and then Serene will come back in, kind of what are you really hoping for from the Singapore International Energy Week, which will be held in just 4 months' time? And believe me, that will go really quickly. Perhaps we go to Thye and then Yulia, perhaps you have the last word. So Thye, please.
Okay, let me have a quick one. For me, sustainable is something very urgent that we need to look into it in the mid to long term. Of course, the current thing is actually COVID-19, that the whole world is actually facing it. So from the business perspective, I look at some business intelligence report. A lot of people actually have a two school of thought. One is saying that, okay, with the current low oil price environment, it's better to jumpstart the economy back on a conventional manner and then only switch to sustainable mode in the later time. Another school of thought is talking about that since we are actually rebaseline our economy, so we should take this opportunity to invest or to switch to accelerate our pace to convert into a sustainable mode. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not sure which method is correct, but personally, I view that this is a good golden opportunity for us to rebaseline, because currently the transport consumption is low, as well as the energy consumption is lower. That's why the oil price is low. And then the government is trying to jumpstart the economy through various financial easing or quantitative easing mode. So I believe we should take this opportunity to actually channel the investment, the fund, into sustainable technology so that we can move forward in a more sustainable way.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And over to you quickly, Yulia, for final words.
Sure. So since we mentioned that we're all together here, it would be really good to see a very diverse a group of participants at the conference representing not only petrochemicals and refining sectors and investors into those type of business, but also companies downstream, upstream that could suggest already practical and good solutions for the petrochemicals and refining companies in terms of low carbon transition. Also, would be really interesting to hear first-hand case studies and stories from companies in the sector who have already implemented measures and have defined their climate targets. Like what motivated them, what are they doing to showcase for other companies in the sector in this region what could be done. And yeah, to hear from the governments what their plans are.
Well, thank you very much, Yulia, for those final words. And thank you as well to Thye, not just for the hour that you've given us here, but for all the planning and effort you've put into your presentations, rehearsals. And before I hand back to Serene from the Energy Markets Authority from the SIEW team, I would just like to say thank you for bringing in the British Chamber of Commerce. We're ready to play our part. And the key word that's coming out of here is together for me, the key word in the SIEW theme. So with that togetherness, thank you very much to the panelists and thanks for the audience who've stayed on. And I'll hand back to Serene for closing comments. Thank you, Serene.
Thank you to our speakers and moderator for the insightful and well-rounded discussions. And thank you to SIEW partner Clarion Events. With that, we have come to the end of the webinar. A recording will be made available online. Fill up the feedback form to share your thoughts and experience on the webinar. We look forward to welcoming you at SIEW 2020 for discussions on this year's theme, Creating Our Low Carbon Energy Future Together, from 26th to 30th October. On behalf of the Energy Market Authority of Singapore, thank you for joining us today.